Great. So welcome to my lecture. My name is Emma Cariello. I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Keepers of the Light, women lighthouse keepers of the Hudson River. I am very excited about this presentation. I've been working on it for a long time. However, I would be remiss if I didn't thank Sarah Wasberg Johnson. She was the former director of exhibits and outreach at our museum. She did a good bulk of this research for me a long time ago. So I had a very robust plethora of research to pick from. That was her work. So I owe a lot to her. So let's get started. I'm going to be reading cards. Just ignore that. Oh, oh no. Ha, there we are. So all the lighthouses we're going to be talking about today were in the 3rd Lighthouse District. This is a 19th century map of that lighthouse district. Give you a minute to check that out. It's pretty cool. So this is a rough timeline of the Hudson River lights. The first was Stony Point. That is the oldest one, and that one is actually still standing, which is very neat. The most recent, which is actually not included on this list, is the 3rd iteration of the Rondout Lighthouse, which is my local one since I'm a Kingstonite. That one was built relatively recently in 1915, and you can kind of get a glimpse of the scope of history that we're talking about, what I call 1915 recent, right? Um, so according to the lighthouse keepers and assistants in the National Archives, at least 122 female keepers were appointed across the country from 1828 to 1905. That's a lot, right? Twice that number were appointed assistant keepers. So we're talking about a lot of women, and a lot of those women actually were never recorded because they only started recording that in 1828. So a lot before then kind of were lost to time. The first one that I know of is from the 18th century. She's from the 1700s. We will not be talking about her today, unfortunately, but she is definitely worth looking into for sure. So what are these people doing? What is their job? We all have heard the phrase lighthouse keeper, but what does that entail? They're lighting and maintaining the lantern. They're winding the light turning mechanism. They're ringing fog bells when it's foggy, of course. They're keeping good records. This is a very interesting one for me. After 1872, keepers were provided with a ledger with instructions for keeping the log on the inner cover. So they were given explicit instructions from the government what they were to write down. An interesting quote from those instructions: no personal opinions or remarks on family affairs or ordinary housework shall be entered in the journal. So it has to be kept professional, right? Um, this position, therefore, required literacy, which I think is very interesting because a lot of positions at the time did not. So they also had to rescue any distressed persons that they saw. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later, a little teaser. A couple of our women lighthouse keepers did save some lives, which is very cool. Lighthouse keepers, they were kind of like first responders at the time, right? When we think of first responders, we think of police, we think of ambulances, but the lighthouse keepers were really on the front lines, for sure. So here we have a woman cleaning that Fresnel lens. This is actually a woman named Fanny Salter at the Turkey Point Light. This is a gentleman cleaning the exterior of the tower. All of the glass had to be kept meticulously clean. It couldn't be sooty. It couldn't be, because then the whole point of the lighthouse is gone. You need to be able to see the light. This is a man refilling an oil reservoir in a Fresnel lens. Some of these lenses were so big that you could actually step inside them, which is very cool. This is a keeper winding the mechanism. This is from around 1900 at West Point. And this is an example of a manually rung fog bell. So you would be pulling the lever, right? So something very important to our topic and to our conversation tonight is canals. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. That same decade, a couple of other New York canals opened, the Champlain Canal in 1823 and the D&H Canal in 1828 were hugely important. The D&H was especially important to us here in Kingston as it terminated right here on the downtown, on the Rondout area. Um, there were steamboats on the Hudson since Robert Fulton in 1807. He was the first one to kind of make steamboats on the Hudson a reality and make them profitable. He had a very large monopoly on these steamboats for a long time until Gibbons versus Ogden, which was in 1824. And you might recognize that name from your social studies classes when you were a kid. You might be scratching your head. That sounds familiar, right? Gibbons versus Ogden was a Supreme Court case that basically decreed that states could not override federal commerce laws. So no more monopolies. Um, After that point, in the 1820s, huge boom in steamships on the Hudson, especially due to those canals. So we need some traffic lights. We need lighthouses, right? Here's a list of some of the women keepers that we're going to be discussing this evening. Just a little context. Anne Whitbeck is Christina Whitbeck's daughter. There's two names right there. And Melinda Rose is Nancy Rose's daughter. So you'll find as we go that very often this was a family affair for families to be keeping these lighthouses together. All of these women were official keepers on the government payroll. They were all on the front lines. First one we're going to be discussing is Stony Point. As I mentioned, that is the oldest lighthouse on the Hudson that still stands today. Sarah Parkinson is the first keeper that we're going to be discussing. Her husband Robert died in 1834. In December of 1834, Sarah was actually replaced. So she only had the position for a few months. Not sure why she was replaced, but she was. She is going to be the shortest tenure that we talk about tonight. Our tenures are going to reach all the way into like 50 years territory. So Sarah wasn't for very long comparatively, right? But that did mean that Sarah and her 5 children were forced to move, and this gentleman named Leonard K. Baker took her place. Here's a later picture of Stony Point Light. This is from around 1900. So Stony Point had 3 female keepers, counting Sarah. Next were the Roses. So Alexander Rose, he served from 1853 to 1857, at which point he passed away. We believe it was because he was carrying some timber to the lighthouse and he popped a blood vessel and he died, which is very tragic. So his wife, Nancy, did have to take over. And this was incredibly common. And this is not the first time that we'll see this tonight, is that a husband would die and the wife would take over. That is very often the case. So their daughter, Melinda, took Nancy Rose's place after she passed away in 1904. Melinda was 53 when she took the position, a little bit older, again, comparatively to our other lighthouse keepers that we're going to talk about. So she only had the position for about a year. Who knows why she left? She might have just been sick of the labor, right? So Nancy Rose was actually very beloved by locals. And she was defended by locals a couple times. In 1901, the steamer Poughkeepsie ran up on the rocks near Stony Point in the fog. So this steamer, this pretty big steamship, kind of ran up and was like forced aground. It's not super clear how this happened. The captain of the Poughkeepsie said he didn't hear a fog bell, while people on the shore swore that they did. So it's unclear whether or not Nancy was ringing the fog bell. A local paper did say that people knocked on the keeper's door to wake Nancy, so it's possible she wasn't awake ringing the bell. So this is a little bit of a history's mystery, right? Was she ringing the bell? Now, no one was hurt. Nancy's daughter Melinda had some pretty interesting choice words about this situation when she was asked by a reporter, did anything interesting happen to you while you were living at this lighthouse? She pretty affirmatively said no. She said the one wreck wasn't really what you might call a wreck, for nobody was hurt, and it wasn't Mother's fault anyway, for both lights were burning as brightly as ever. So if you ask Melinda, it was not her mother's fault, right? In 1903, Nancy retired at 79. She was awarded a service medal from the Scenic and Historic Society. And in the 1904, the same year that Melinda takes over, Nancy passes away. So those are the Roses. Very interesting family, right? The Stuyvesant Lighthouse. This is from around 1900. This is a postcard. This is the second one. It was built in the 1860s. The first Stuyvesant Lighthouse was built in 1829. Volkert Whitbeck was its first keeper. He served from 1830 to around 1841. That original lighthouse was destroyed in 1832. I'm going to read an article about that shortly so we can hear what that was like for the Whitbecks. After Volkert died, his wife Christine took over, followed by their daughter Anna. So this is a letter found in the American Railroad Journal that I'm going to read to you guys off of my phone. This is a pretty tragic little story, and it's very interesting to hear what people at the time thought of this disaster, right? Tuesday evening, March 13th, 1832. To the editor of the Kinderhook Sentinel, Sir, I am about to record one of the most afflicting and singular providences I ever witnessed. The Hudson River had been rising for more than 24 hours when the ice began to give way. It was thought that the lighthouse, standing about a mile above the landing, was in danger of being injured by the large bodies of ice which were floating down the river. About 12 o'clock today, two gentlemen with great difficulty, sorry, I lost my place, made the lighthouse in a small boat, as it was now standing in and entirely surrounded by water. They advised Mr. Whitbeck, the occupant of the house, to leave it together with his family immediately. They accordingly made preparations to do so by removing their furniture into the upper story and making a comfortable disposition of their cows and other stock, so they're getting ready to leave the lighthouse. When nearly ready to leave their threatened home, suddenly and with terrible violence, the ice came rushing upon the house. They were startled by one awful and tremendous crash, and in less than a minute, the whole two-story stone edifice was a mingled heap of ruins. The family, consisting of 10 persons, with the exception of one, were in the building when it fell. 4 of them disappeared and were either buried beneath the ruins or swept off by the flood. 2 daughters of Mr. Whitbeck, one aged 15 and the other 13, and 2 of his grandsons, one 14 and the other 2, were victims of this dire catastrophe. By timely assistance afforded by the 2 gentlemen alluded to, who were near in a boat, 6 out of 10 were saved. The survivors were badly bruised and on reaching the shore, so chilled and exhausted that they were unable to walk. They were taken to a house nearby and made as comfortable as circumstances would admit. I am informed that it is not expected Mrs. Whitbeck will recover, and that the recovery of the other members of the family is considered very doubtful. I have seen and conversed with Mr. W. this evening. He was as comfortable as I expected to find him, but he was a man of sorrows and afflicted with grief. My heart moved within me when I saw the man and heard him speak. His eyes were suffused with tears when he spoke of the calamity which had bereft him of his dear children. The sympathies of all the bystanders were so excited in his that they wept, but I could endure it no longer when he raised his streaming eyes towards heaven and cried in the agony of his heart and of his soul, "Oh, my children, where are they?" This family is now left in a destitute condition to share the lot of the suffering and of the poor. Yours, John Allen. Wow, right? What a storyteller John Allen is. Couple of inconsistencies, not to, correct him. But of course, we do know Mrs. Whitbeck did survive. right? He did mention that he didn't think that she would. She did survive. She does recover, but the family was left destitute with no job. Um, Locals petitioned President Martin Van Buren, who was actually a native of that area. He was a native of Kinderhook, to keep Volkert on until the new light was built. They said, hey, listen, there's no lighthouse. Let this gentleman keep his job until the next one is built. And he did. So Volkert remained on his salary, but had no job until the completion of the next lighthouse. So that's that pretty wild story there. This is an example of why we need to be discerning with our sources as history people, right? So this newspaper is false. It says that Anne received the position in 1832. This is untrue. Also confuses Anne for the wife instead of the daughter to Volkert. So she was not Volkert's wife, she was Volkert's daughter. Um, it also says that Volkert was killed in that ice, catastrophe, which was also untrue, right? He did survive. So keep your eye open to sources and make sure that you don't believe just one source. So the Rondout, that's our pet one here in Kingston. This is the first iteration pictured here, built in 1837. And this drawing is from 1845. For a while, this was the only image that we had of this lighthouse. It was kind of like a white whale, like they were looking for pictures of this lighthouse, and they found this painting. And you might be saying, there's no lighthouse in this painting. It's by James McEntee, a great artist. There it is. It is right there, right on the foreground there. Very small, but still there, right? Yay. So this lighthouse had a number of male keepers, up to and including this gentleman named George Murdoch, right? In 1856, he became the keeper of that first lighthouse right there. George Murdoch was the keeper there. Unfortunately, he did not hold the position for long. Similarly to other stories, right, he did pass away. He drowned due to intoxication. His obituary said accidental drowning due to intoxication. So he had gone to shore to get groceries and he never came back. Now, his wife, Catherine, had a very young child, James, and two older children to take care of at this point, as well as taking care of the light. So Catherine is kind of remarkable, George's wife. After George's drowning, she petitioned the government to give her the title of head keeper. They were reticent at first. The locals of the Rondout kind of like got behind her, and they said, hey, listen, she's been keeping this light very well since George's death, and she has a young son who will make a good apprentice, a good assistant keeper. So she was given the position on July 11th, 1857. So she's the second longest serving keeper in the country. She served for 50 years, 1857 to 1907. A gentleman named William Welch beat her by a couple of years. He is the longest serving in the United States history. She was assisted by her son James, who became head keeper in 1907 when she retired. So it all kind of went according to plan, right? James was always going to be the assistant and then the head keeper after Catherine, his mother, left. This is the lighthouse that Catherine would have been spending most of her time in. The original was replaced in 1867. That's when this new one was built. I'm going to read you another article from the Daily Freeman, a paper that some of you may be familiar with. This was Catherine's worst time in the lighthouse. This was when it was all kind of going down for her, but she survived and the lighthouse survived. So we're going to talk about it right now. The worst time that Mrs. Murdoch thinks she ever experienced was on the night of December 19th, 1878, at which time the big flood in the Rondout Creek and Hudson River occurred. At about 10 o'clock on that night, The waters began to rise to an alarming degree and surge and boil around the lighthouse. On the previous afternoon, a friend of Mrs. Murdoch's, who had forebodings of danger, visited the lighthouse and urged her to go ashore, telling her that the lighthouse would surely be swept away and she and her children would be drowned. She replied, "I will never desert my post of duty. I am a woman, I know, but if the lighthouse goes down tonight, I go with it." The lighthouse remains today upon the same sound foundation as it did that night. At 12 o'clock that night, Mrs. Murdoch ascended the tower and looked out. She could not see anything. It was pitch dark, but the sound of the rushing waters told her plainly that the flood, instead of decreasing, was increasing. At about 3 o'clock, the guard lock at Eddyville gave way. The water swept everything before it. Boats were torn loose from their moorings and caught up by the raging flood. In one instance, a barn, containing a horse and a number of chickens, was swept from its foundation. It glided along with the swift current, keeping in the middle of the stream, until it reached the dike opposite the lighthouse, where it struck. When daylight appeared, Mrs. Murdoch was amazed to see a horse standing on the dike, trembling with fright, while all around the animal surged a mighty vortex of muddy waters. Most of the barn, which had gone to pieces, lay piled on a heap on the site of the old lighthouse. This explained the loud crash of timber she had heard, and what at first she thought was the lighthouse falling apart. The flats were strewn with the wrecks of schooners, sloops, and barges. One schooner rested on the top of the dike. Before any attempt could be made to rescue the horse, the animal plunged into the water and swam to Port Ewan, a distance of over a mile, none the worse for its thrilling adventure. That is from around the 1880s, and it was found in the Murdoch scrapbook. So Catherine was kind of cool, right? She said, "I'm a woman, I know, but if this lighthouse goes down tonight, I go with it." And we love quoting that. And we do have a very big soft spot for Catherine Murdoch at the Hudson River Maritime Museum. So as I mentioned, in 1880, her son James was appointed assistant keeper. At some point, Catherine does remarry. Yay! She marries a man named Jeremiah Perkins, and she has another son, William. In 1907, she finally quit. She moved ashore, and she died at 81 years old a couple years later. There's her obituary. And I'm going to give you a second to take a peek at that if you want, or take a screenshot, or whatever you want to do. She is interred in Port Ewan, so you can visit her if you want to. And I think I might. I think I'm going to take a little pilgrimage and visit Catherine and have a chat with her, right? This is the third and final Rondout Lighthouse. This is that newest one that I mentioned at the very beginning. This is the one that stands today. James was the first keeper of that one, James Murdoch, and he moved in with his wife, Emma. No relation, right? The Howards were another group of keepers at the Rondout. Now, they did not have a woman keeper in their family, but they had a couple of remarkable little girls that lived in that lighthouse with them as a family. They lived there. He lived there with his wife and daughters, Lila and Esther. Lila is the oldest girl on the left. She's the tallest one. So there's this great story that we love to tell at the museum, that this woman came for a tour of the lighthouse. She saw the image that you see to your right there, and she said, "That's me." It was Esther. She was visiting the museum. And of course, the docent clamored on her, and, "Oh my God, please tell us more." So Esther gave her remembrances of living in the lighthouse to the museum. So that picture on the right is Robert with Lila and Esther. That is how the girls got to school. They walked on the ice to school when it was winter. One day the ice did give way, and Esther fell through. Her sister was there to drag her out, and they kind of trudged home, freezing cold, and they got home, and their mother said, "Oh, I'm so glad that you saved her. You still have to go to school that day." So the little girls did not get out of school. for the day, unfortunately. But that's Esther and Lila, two very cute little girls living at the Rondout Lighthouse. The Saugerties Light. Um, this is the, again, original, again, with that pattern of 1820s and 30s. We build lighthouses. They fall apart by the 1860s. We rebuild them out of sturdier materials. That keeps happening. I don't know if you've noticed. So that's the original Saugerties Lighthouse right there, built in 1835. Abraham Schoonmaker became the head keeper in 1845. Um, Something very interesting happened with these two. There was a little bit of a tug of war with a gentleman named Joseph Burhans and Abraham and Dorcas. So before the Civil War, lighthouse keepers were directly appointed by the president. The president would appoint these lighthouse keepers. In 1842, under President Tyler, Joseph A. Burhans was appointed the keeper. Great. In 1844, Polk became president. He appointed Abraham Schoonmaker in 45. Abraham died a year later. His wife Dorcas took his place, and then the Whigs controlled the government again in 1849, and Burhans was back in. So as I said, a little bit of a tug of war there, but it did end with Joseph Burhans being the keeper, unfortunately. So Dorcas, again, similar to Sarah at the beginning, did not have the longest tenure as a keeper, right? This is that new Saugerties Lighthouse. This is the one that is standing today that you can walk to. It's quite lovely. I'm sure that many of you have. It's very cool. The Crowleys are the next group that we're going to discuss. They moved in 1865, right before that new lighthouse was built. Dennis Crowley went blind, and he had to give up his position, obviously, quickly. His son Daniel took over, then left for a more lucrative job in 1873. So Kate took over, assisted by her sister Ellen. It's unclear why she left, but her nephew James took over in 1885. He served until 1895. Now, the Crowley sisters are actually quite remarkable, much like Catherine Murdoch, and really all the women that we've talked about today in their own special ways. I'm going to read you guessed it, another newspaper article. This article is very interesting. It made the rounds among many New York papers. It kind of went viral, honestly, is what happened. In it, a sailor witnesses an accident, and he talks about witnessing that accident, and he sees the Crowley sisters. And I'm going to read you that document right now. Hardly a minute elapsed before two female forms were fluttering around the small boat by the lighthouse. In another minute, it was launched, and it bobbed up and down in the seething, foaming waters. The two girls, bareheaded, with a pair of oars apiece, began pulling toward the men in the water. So there's men struggling in the water, and the Crowley sisters are rowing out to help them. The waves ran so high, the gale blew so madly, the thunder roared so incessantly, and the lightning flashed in such blinding sheets, that it seemed impossible for the women ever to reach the men, to keep headway, or to keep from being swamped. But they never missed the opportunity of a rising billow to give them leverage, and they managed by steady pulling to get ahead until they reached the men in the water. The great danger was that the tossing boat would strike the sailors and end their career, but one of the gals leaned forward over the bow of the boat, braced her feet beneath the seat on which she had been sitting, stiffened herself out for a great effort, and as her sister kept the bow of the craft crosswise to the waves, caught one of the men beneath the arms as he struck out on top of a billow, lifted and threw him by main force into the middle of the boat, and then prepared for the other man. He had got hold of the sloop's rudder, which had got unshipped, and was floating on the water. He let go and swam toward the rowboat, and was hauled in also by the woman and his half-drowned comrade. You couldn't have got any river boatman to do what those girls did. So the Crowleys saved a couple lives. As I mentioned earlier, we can really think of lighthouse keepers as these sort of first responders of this era. And similar to Catherine Murdoch, who refused to leave her position, they did not let their gender or society's norms get in the way of what their job was. You can kind of tell that by the way that sailor says that they were bareheaded. Ooh, they didn't have any bonnet on or anything like that, which was kind of a big deal. It was very casual, right? So the Crowleys were very special. Here we have a very important woman in the story of the continuing story of the Saugerties Lighthouse. Um, she was never a keeper, but Ruth Glunt was an important figure. She wrote a 1975 book, Lighthouses and Legends of the Hudson. She got Saugerties Light on the National Register in 1978, and she helped found the Lighthouse Conservancy in 1985. That Saugerties Lighthouse was in very rough shape when that conservancy took over. So we have a lot to owe to Ruth Glunt that we can still go to the Saugerties Lighthouse and enjoy it, right? This is the final lighthouse that we're going to talk about tonight, um, the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse. This structure pictured was built in 1871 to replace an 1839 structure. That little island that you see back there, that was where the 1839 structure was. So they just built it a little bit next door, right? Andrew A. McLintlock was keeper from 1926 to 1932. So we're talking more recent now, right? Doris, his daughter pictured very cutely, grew up in the lighthouse. She grew up in the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse. Um, she wrote a book about her experiences called Dory of the Lighthouse that I tried to get my hands on and could not find anywhere. It's a rare book, it seems. So if you can find it on eBay or something, pick it up. Absolutely pick it up. Um, she also assisted the Save Esopus Meadows Lighthouse Commission in restoring the lighthouse. So since she lived there, she could kind of tell them this room was used for that. These walls were this color. This is the kind of furniture that we had, which if you're a history person at all, or even a museum goer, you know is invaluable. You know, I wish at some of the museums that I worked at that I had someone that had lived there that could tell us if we were getting it right, right? So we've talked about some very remarkable women tonight. Some women who, as I said, did not let the time that they lived in get in the way of their job, of their position. They took their jobs very seriously. They oftentimes took them over from their husbands, and it was a family affair for them. And it was an art, a lost art, keeping lighthouses. The Rondout light was automated in 1950. So no more need for a keeper. I'm pretty sure the only one in the country that still has a keeper is the Boston Light. I could be wrong. That's just off the top of my head. But there aren't. Lighthouse keeper is a very antiquated phrase and a very antiquated position, right? So I thank you guys very deeply for joining me tonight on this journey, for listening to me. I do want to talk about the Hudson River Maritime Museum for just a quick second, if you will let me shill for a moment. We are open Thursdays to Sundays from 11 to 5. Pop by, say hello. I also sit at the front desk, so you might recognize my face and see me again. This is our solar-powered boat, Solaris. If you are curious at all about the Rondout Lighthouse, hop on Solaris. It takes trips out there from May to October. So I would absolutely recommend getting on and going around that lighthouse with a docent and hearing about the Murdochs and all of that good stuff. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything at all, we love to hear from you. Here's our contact information. And that about wraps it up for me. I think we have time for some questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, Emma, there are some questions in the chat. I'll read them to you.
Oh, okay, yeah, please do.
The first one from John says, did they live in the lighthouses? And you think
So oftentimes they did not live in, well, it depends on the lighthouses you're talking about. The one on the coasts, which were like those big tall ones, would have separate keepers quarters, right? These ones, as let me go back and show you. See how it's one building? A lot of the times, these smaller ones are one building, so they do technically live in the lighthouse. Yes, maybe not in the tower, but they live in it. Yeah.
Cool. Um, that answers the second one as well. In the 1867 Saugerties Lighthouse, oh, sorry, is the 1867 Saugerties Lighthouse in the same place as the original? We stayed overnight in 2001 and we were able to walk to it because it was low tide.
Yes, it is a bed and breakfast that is booked out for a long time. So if you want to stay in there, I would definitely get on that. As far as I know, it's in the same position. The only one that I know that really moved around a lot was the Rondout Light because the mouth of the creek changed. Uh, man-made. It didn't change on its own. We changed it. But that meant that the Rondout Light had to move around. The Saugerties one, I'm pretty sure, is right around that same area. Yeah. I could be wrong, though. It's worth looking into.
Next is how many lighthouses in, sorry, how many lighthouses in the ones you discussed were rebuilt? Were they all rebuilt at some point?
Except for Stony Point. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you whiplash. Look away if you don't want to. They were all changed. I'm pretty sure Stony Point is the only one that was not. That one is the oldest one that still stands. It was built in 1826. So that one is quite old. The others, as I said, there was a big surge in lighthouse rebuilding in the 1860s and 70s. So they were all rebuilt. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, Gloria asks, how did the lightkeepers spend their day?
Oh, that is such a good question. Um, if only I knew the exact answer. If only I could be a fly on the wall, right? These were families. Oftentimes, the stereotype of a lighthouse keeper is a lonely bachelor out in the unknown. Um, but these families would be living family life, right? They'd be eating meals together. What was there to do for entertainment in the 19th century? They would be knitting, they would be writing letters, all of that good stuff, reading. So it's pretty much just life, but you lived at work. So you had to constantly make sure that like the glass wasn't sooty or anything like that. If it was, you had to fix it right away. So that's my best guess as to how they'd be spending their days in the 19th century in lighthouses.
So Peggy says the Hudson Lighthouse had a family that lived there, and the children walked to school over the frozen river and rowed a boat to Athens.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
That's similar to the Rondout light.
Great.
Yeah, did not know that. Thank you.
And someone asked for you to say again the last name of the woman that wrote the Lighthouses and Legends.
Ooh, Glunt. Glunt. Yes, Ruth Glunt.
And the last question here is from Samantha. Do you have a favorite keeper and why?
Catherine Murdoch is remarkable. Um, I just, you can't get over that quote, right? If the lighthouse goes down tonight, I go with it. She was very no nonsense. Um, like all of them were. Really, it wasn't a job that left room for much nonsense, honestly. And these were people that were hardened by life, right? They lost husbands, they lost children. Catherine, I think, was a very interesting figure, so she might be my favorite.
I have a question. Which
Yeah.
one of these lighthouses remained the longest? Like, what was the last family that was maintaining these lighthouses?
Which one? Because the Murdochs were keeping for the longest time.
Mhm.
They were keeping like from the very beginning,
Mhm.
from close to the very beginning of the Rondout Light, right up until that new one was built. So 1856 to 1915,
But I
around.
mean, in modern times, in the 1900s, like were these lighthouses last being manned by people?
Like the late 40s to 50s.
Okay.
Yeah, so recently, very
Yeah.
recently.
Oh,
Yeah.
we got some more questions here. Hold on.
Yeah.
So what were the precautions these ladies had child rearing and pregnancy?
Like what were the precautions for them, like work hazard wise?
I guess.
Um, I don't know. I honestly don't know. You hear stories. I keep bringing up the Murdochs, but when George Murdoch died, Catherine had just had James, her youngest child. He was a newborn, basically. And I've always found that very striking. And I've always kind of wondered the same thing. Um, how were these women watching over these children while also doing this very strenuous job? If I had to guess, I know that back in the day, children were very often parentified. So, if you were an older child, you were taking care of your younger sibling for the most part. It could be that. Um, but really, it was a very treacherous job. I mean, you heard about, the Volkerts and people that died when it was swept away and, all of these things. Um, so yeah, it was quite a dangerous job, and I think that that's worth looking into for sure.
And the last one here is John is asking, are there any lighthouse keepers now? If not, if no, why not?
Um, I am pretty sure, and I'm gonna look this up after. So come visit me at the museum and we'll talk about it. But in my own research that I've done in the past, the I could look it up right now, but that would be rude. But the Boston Lights, I think it's called, has someone that like checks in on it. I don't think he lives there or she lives there. Um, but that's like the latest one that I know of. And why not? Well, because they were automated. Just like everything, so many jobs disappear because of automation, and this is one of them. Right.
Samantha asks, when did the light mechanism change from oil, gas to electric?
That's another great question. I know that the Rondout light didn't get electric until like the 40s. It took a while. Um, I don't know the exact answer, but it took a while, I would say. If the Rondout light is any indication, anyway.
He's also asking, can you explain a bit of how that changed?
Mm. Um, I'm not the best expert on the exact machinations of the lighthouses. Um, I'm more about the people that lived in them. Uh, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that, but I'll say what I've been saying. It's worth looking into. I'm not sure.
He said, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Um,
Anybody else?
yeah, one more. Megan,
Yay.
since they were on government pay, did they also get government rations for supplies like food?
Yep. So they would be getting rations. They would be getting potatoes, molasses, coffee, tea, um, haddock, fish, dried beef, things that could keep for the most part, things that could keep. And they were getting government rations. Yes, they were taken care of by the government in that way. I do know that George Murdoch passed away when he went ashore for groceries. I don't know if he was picking up his rations or if he was buying things for himself. Um, in terms of the drunkenness of him, he might have been supplying his own liquor because there is a rule in the handbook for lightkeepers from, I want to say, 1887 that no intoxicated persons are allowed anywhere near the light itself. For obvious reasons, right? They could get seriously hurt. George managed to get hurt anyway, but they were receiving government rations, and since they were on government payroll, yes. Hmm.
Megan asked, what was the rations based on individual or for the family?
For the family, they gave a lot. They gave a lot. Like even if it was an individual, they'd be receiving about as much as a family would eat just to keep them fed. Um, so yeah.
All right, it looks like that's it. If anybody else has any questions, if you get it in real fast. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you for everybody's questions. I thought they were great. And thank
I
you,
did
Emma,
too.
for your